Hey, welcome to lesson number 5 in the third module of the Ultimate ZBrush Guide course. And in this video, we're going to concentrate on adjusting all those shapes that we created in the previous videos and especially in the last video. So this video is going to be slightly different. It's a bit shorter and there's going to be a bit more of the time lapses. So I'm just going to go through the process, explain what I'm going to do, which tools I'm going to be using, and then we're going to move into time lapse because again, it becomes very repetitive to watch. So I'm going to jump straight into this video. And another reason why this video is going to be slightly different is because we're not going to use a new custom UI. Instead, we're going to keep using the one that we used in the past video, right, or in the previous video. So we're going to concentrate on a couple of things. Let me just bring in my Epic pen here so that I can write on the screen. So we're going to concentrate on these brushes again. So the AccuCurve, the Move brush, and the Move Topological. And we might also use the Inflate here as well if we need to, but this is going to be pretty much the whole tool set that we're going to use for this video. So the idea is to go over each one of the pieces and adjust the shape and adjust the placement of this, just to make sure that everything sort of fits together, or that everything feels that it has volume and that it can actually react to the gravity and the laws of physics, right? So part of the idea of this process is not only adjusting the shapes, but deciding whether or not we need more volume. So if you remember in the previous video, we had the dynamics of vision on the belt, on these straps here, as well as these straps. Let me go ahead and turn on Polyframe, right? So that's all good. We just need to concentrate on placing these in a better way. Now, the only thing I want to mention is that we're going to keep this with dynamic subdivision just so that we can see everything a bit smoother. However, if you turn on dynamic subdivision, the placement of these straps, for example, might look slightly different. So when we enable dynamic, this looks a little bit too smooth and it sort of like loses the that strappy type of idea that we're going for. So when you're doing the adjustment of the shape and the placement for anything that has subdivision or dynamic subdivision enabled, make sure that you turn it on and off just to double check that everything is working. Ultimately, we're going to be using the smoothed version of this. However, sometimes we might want to add an extra loop. So for example, in the case of these straps here, let me go ahead and turn off dynamic and Polyframe. So in this case, we have a polygon or a face that is slightly wider, right? So when we use dynamic subdivision, then this larger polygon in contrast with this shorter polygon is going to create a very soft transition. So if you look at this from, let's say, from the inside, from the profile view, it will look like that, right? So that's kind of like inside. And then if you use dynamic subdivision, it will end up looking kind of like this, right? So these corners are going to be rather flat, and we want to keep them a little bit, a bit straight. So we want to go for something more like this, right? So we could go ahead and play with the dynamic subdivision options that I showed you a few videos ago, just so that we can see more of how this is actually going to look. Or we can go ahead and keep this dynamic on and off, or keep playing with the on and off of the dynamic subdivision to make sure we place these polygons properly. All of this is going to make more sense when I actually get to it, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview. So let's go ahead and enable dynamic. And what I mean about playing around with the dynamic options is, let's go ahead and open up the geometry palette here. Dynamic subdivision is this skew grid and this flat subdivision. So I explained this already in another video, but if we enable, let's say, one level of flatness or subdivision, and we turn off Polyframe, you see that the borders are now a little bit sharper. We can go ahead and add maybe 2, just to keep increasing that sharpness. But now this looks a little bit too flat and you can start to see the polygons. So again, you can just go ahead and play around with these values, maybe increasing the smoothness a bit more, reduce this to 1, and you start to get something that looks a little bit more realistic. The same thing goes for the straps, right? So we can either add a bit of flatness here and increase the smoothness a couple of times. In this case, it doesn't really work as well. So I'm going to leave this flat subdivision to 0. And let's go ahead and do the same thing for the belt here. So I'm going to add 1 flat subdivision. All right, so so that we can keep that thickness a little bit more even along the edges. That's really all there is to it. But you can opt in to just work with the dynamic subdivision as it is. So again, this is just changing the flat subdivision with the smooth subdivision to 3, right? And this is totally up to you, depending on how you want to work. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as it is so that when I adjust the shapes, I have a better idea of how these volumes are represented. All right, so I'm going to start with the straps here. And again, this is another thing that I mentioned in the last video that is kind of like a workaround or a different way to deal with the different subtools without having to go into solo mode, right? Because solo mode is going to activate just the subtool that you have selected. So let me just repeat the process that I showed in the last video. I'm going to go ahead and hold the Shift key and click on the visibility icon for the subtools, and Siri is going to turn everything off. That's great. And then I'm going to turn on only the ones that I want to keep while I'm working. So in this case, I want the backpack, and I also want the shirt. And that's about it. Those are the meshes that are interacting with my straps. So that way I can just concentrate on only these, and it's not going to be as heavy as well to play around with this, and it's going to be easy to, again, concentrate on only that. I'm also going to turn on polyframe so that we can see which one is the one that we are affecting. And I'm going to go into Move Brush, and I'm going to enable AccuCurve. Okay, so just before I go into the time lapse, there's a couple of things that I want to mention. So when you're using the AccuCurve or any of the move brushes, you can start moving things around and things might look okay. Let me just do it with a smaller brush size so that I make the effect a little bit more evident. Right? I start move things around, and if I get out of this dynamic mode, you'll see that the edge now is quite different. And we want to maintain a consistent thickness. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can tweak that later on, but just be aware that when you move things around to adjust the shapes, try to grab both of these vertices. So if I undo this, I want to probably do it with a larger brush size, and that would be my recommendation, so that when you grab either the top one or the bottom one, you're actually grabbing or affecting most of the area. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and start adjusting the shapes. And when I say start adjusting the shapes, all I mean is try to make sure that when you move the polygons and do these little nudges of the geometry, they feel like they have some weight and they are actually part of the design, or they can actually exist. Otherwise, they look like, floating items in relation to the other meshes. And when in doubt, just make sure that the bottom part of whatever mesh you're adjusting is in contact with the underlying surface. So in other words, the inside of these polygons, right, that are not going to be seen, I want to try to maintain them, try to place them along the surface. It's sometimes going to be very hard to describe the same curvature of the underlying surface. So make sure that it looks plausible. So just to give you a practical example, if I push this one too much, like so, then it looks like an intersecting geometry. But if I just leave it as it is right now, this works a little bit better. So it really becomes a matter of finding a good balance between intersections of the different meshes. Of course, what you want to avoid is, for example, in this area where there should be some contact and some pressure of, the weight of these straps with the gravity, being affected by the gravity, is not having something that looks kind of like open like that, right? So that's kind of like the main idea of this step, just making sure that everything feels that it could exist in reality, although this is, a made-up creature. Whereas in this area here at the bottom, we can, we're more free to play around with this, with the placement, because we just need to consider how the shape and the material of this strap is actually behaving. So I'm just going to very briefly tweak this a bit, and I think this is fair enough. This is working fine. Just want to go over the overall shape and make sure everything is consistent. You don't want to have a very inconsistent strap, right? You don't want to have something that looks big in one side and tiny in another. So this is part of the adjustment. So here, for example, this is slightly smaller, so I'm going to push it. Try to maintain the same ratio, the same width all over the strap. Okay, so I think that's it for the strap. I'm going to jump now into the time-lapse mode, where I'm going to keep editing and tweaking the placement and the shape of these meshes, as well as the straps and the belt. So before I actually go into that, let me just bring all the ones that I'm going to need. Where's my t-shirt and the backpack. All right. Also, probably I'm going to need the pants and all of these pieces here at the bottom, right? So that I can keep tweaking those. I just want to mention something in terms of workflow before I go into the time lapse that have to do with the placements of these straps. Now, you might not find a perfect way to overlap these ones, right? As in, not all of the straps will actually work perfectly fine and overlap perfectly fine over each other. What you want to maintain, though, is a good balance, again, with the overall shape, right? So, for instance, if I go ahead and start moving these things around, what I want to pay attention to is the primary shape, how much bulginess and how much silhouette these straps are generating. So I want to maintain kind of like an even surface that follows the forearm. What you need to be careful with, though, is that as soon as you start pushing all of these things, you can end up with something that looks very uneven, right? Just because you're trying to put one on top of the other. So don't worry too much about the intersection of some of these. Just make sure that whatever is visible, it feels that it could work, that it perhaps is one single strap wrapped all around it, okay? But be careful about this effect and try to maintain a nice, even surface all across. So that's one of the main things that I want to do. All right, so I'm going to jump into a time lapse to fix this as well as the other pieces and how they interact with the mesh. One thing, though, before I actually get started with the time lapse, is that you don't have to limit yourself to adjust the shape of the new objects. You can actually, if you like the placement of this object, you can go to the t-shirt, for example, and start moving the t-shirt or moving these other pieces, right? So it's just a matter of adjusting the interaction between all the shapes, all the different subtools, all right? And hopefully this is going to be a great practice so that you can get more comfortable when dealing with multiple subtools, because right now we have quite a few. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the time lapse, and I'll see you in just a second. So those are the straps already tweaked. So we have the straps for the arm as well as the backpack. So now I'm going to do the belt, and that's going to be relatively simple, using the same techniques, just masking or isolating by polygroups. But fortunately, in this case, we have everything separate in subtools. So we have, the skirt, the front of the skirt, displacement, this placeholder, the pants, the belt, and the back as well. So this one is going to be relatively easy, but I'm going to also adjust the shape of the t-shirt a little bit so that it has sort of like Let me just draw it here so that there is actually compression in the cloth. So instead of being a straight line like that and getting into the belt, what I'll do is I'm gonna make it bolt a little bit like that, and I'm gonna use only the move tool to do that. It's just a slight adjustment to the bulginess here, so that it feels like this is actually getting inside the belt. So it might, from a profile view, from here, it might look something like this, right? Rather than a flat line. Okay, and that also helps to accentuate the fact that this is a loose piece of cloth or a material that is a little bit loose and it just goes inside the belt. But again, I'm using exactly the same techniques, just the move brush, move topological, AccuCurve if I need to, and masking and selecting tools. So it's just a full recap of the tools that we have already used to adjust the shape. So I'm going to jump into the time lapse now and adjust the placement of all these pieces in relation to the belt. So that completes the adjustment of the shapes. And as you can see, just by adding a tiny little bit of volume here around the waist, it feels more like the belt is now applying some pressure just because of these slightly tweaked shapes, right? These adjustments. So it feels more like it's actually holding the pants rather than just a piece of geometry stuck on top of everything. We also tweak this one, so let's just turn everything that we tweaked in this video. All right, in fact, let's go ahead and turn everything on so that we know we have a good reference of everything that we're working on. Okay, perfect. Now there are some other shapes that we can go ahead and tweak if you want to at this stage, but this is kind of like an initial pass to make sure that all the volumes that we are adjusting are actually in place. Now, because I went ahead and worked on these two pieces kind of like in isolation, I have to come back and tweak the placement of these straps. Just because I moved the t-shirt a little bit forward, I can go ahead and reposition this slightly, tiny bit more. And those are the type of things that you're gonna get familiar the more you do it, and the more projects that you work on, and so on and so forth. You're gonna get familiar with this workflow. But as you can see, it's pretty simple. It's just the move brush and adjusting shapes. And just by doing that, what we did in this video, in this lesson, although it's pretty simple, very self-explanatory, and we're limiting our tool set to just the move brushes and the smooth brush perhaps, it can make a huge difference if you concentrate on how everything interacts with each other. And that is kind of like the point of this step. Now, in the case of this belt, I feel like if I go into solo mode, I feel it's slightly thinner. I want to make it a bit more thicker so that we can work on some details later on. So I'm just going to inflate it a tiny bit, just a tiny bit, and there we go. And then we can just work on more details. Now, like I said, you can spend more time in the adjustment, but this is an initial pass. For example, if we enable polyframe and select this piece, this doesn't have the final geometry that we're going to use, right? That's gonna come later in the course. We're going to create a new geometry. So right now, we just need to have something that feels right. But once we create the retopology or the proper topology that this piece is going to have, we're going to have to come back and readjust things anyway. So this is just a quick pass, and that's why this video is full of time lapses, because it's a quick pass to generate the ideas, and then we're going to have to adjust them later on. I'm going to go ahead and select this piece in here. I'm going to turn off the line, and I'm also going to adjust these shapes a tiny bit. Because every time that you move something, and if you're not paying attention to the rest of the objects, you can break the the illusion that this character actually could exist and that these pieces are part of this character. So I just wanna do a little bit of tweaking here, maybe on the backpack as well. I want to make sure that symmetry is enabled for this. Just push it down. Again, this is something that is just going to be a placeholder, and we're going to work on that later on. But just want to make sure everything feels right. I'm going to turn off symmetry here for not for the body. Sorry, let me just undo that. For this hand here, and I want to try to push this in a bit more. All right, and just adjust the shapes of a tiny bit more of this hand. And these are very, very tiny tweaks. You might think this actually is not doing anything, but every little bit and every little space that you have to sort of like step back and judge the progress that you're doing is actually really good, so that you can also learn how to self-assess the progress that you're making and whether or not the changes that you need to do are going to affect the design in a positive way. So what I mean by that is, after you do this multiple times, even though this might not look like I'm changing things tremendously, this is just little nudges here and there, because I'm looking at it from every single angle that I can and rotating things around. All of these little changes, they're going to fine-tune the placement and the volumes and overall the silhouette quite a bit, right? So that's basically what I wanted to do in this video. And just to wrap it up, let's go ahead and go into the pants and just make it a little bit more bulging. Just more volume here towards the bottom, and use the smooth brush. I'm gonna go into solo mode and also add a bit more volume here at the back. And again, every time that you work on solo mode now from this point onwards, because you're adjusting the shapes, you need to make sure that you toggle solo mode off and double check the interaction of the pieces that you tweaked or that you changed the volumes with the rest of the character. So right now I'm just trying to make sure that the silhouette and the volume of the pants by themselves work, but then I can go ahead and check how they look or how they work with the rest of the body. So now there's some intersection here, so I can select this piece, bring it forward a tiny bit more, and readjust the shape. So I'm going to do that with every part that is interacting now with the pants. And for the most part, this is my recommendation, and this is the workflow, or the steps of the workflow that I would recommend you try to get familiar with. That every time that you adjust something, you can come back and revisit and review the entire progress of the character, or all the pieces that you're tweaking, and making sure that everything works with each other, right? It's again trying to find the balance between all these pieces. All right, so basically that's it for this lesson. Again, like I said, this one is slightly different from the other ones. It's pretty simple. The workflow that we're using is more about the time lapses and spending time. So I would recommend to spend as much time as you need at this stage, just tweaking the shapes, making sure that everything feels solid as a whole piece, not as individual pieces or meshes, before we move into the next video. Now, in the next video, I'm going to introduce you to yet another tool in ZBrush that is incredibly powerful for sketching. So remember, I just want to reiterate that at this point, everything is very subject to change. It's very organic, right? So if for some reason you want to add or remove something or change things, at this stage, we can still do it using Dynamesh or the new feature that I'm going to introduce in the next video, which is called the Sculptris Pro. So I'm going to leave this lesson here, and I'll see you in the next video.